work, around $8 billion, and a little under $3 billion of those dollars is used specifically for detention. So again, it is something that is very, very lucrative. And while some people may be in detention for around a month or less, there are a lot of people who are in detention for months and years at a time. And in the East Coast, we have some of the facilities that have some of the longest times for people who are detained. So for example, in New York, Orange County and Buffalo, in New Jersey, Essex, Bergen and Hudson, and Pennsylvania, Pike County. And then for some others in other parts of the US that have some of the longest carceral times are Douglas County in Nebraska, Northwest in Washington, and Etowah in Alabama. And I do also want to note that for the jails in New Jersey, as of last year, ICE no longer has contracts with them, and that is because of the work of so many advocates and community organizers. I also want to name that the majority of people who are detained do not have legal representation. In 2016, it was cited that around only 14% of detained people had attorneys. And this is something that prolongs people's time in detention when they do not have legal representation. When people have attorneys, they are more likely to be released from detention. They are more likely to win their asylum hearings, and also more likely to even seek asylum in the first place, because it is very hard to navigate these systems without knowledge on immigration law. And then I also want to note that since 2003, over 200 people have died in ICE custody, including 21 deaths in 2020, and that was the highest death toll in 15 years. And I want to name that the deaths that happen with ICE go beyond what is happening in the actual facilities. There are hundreds of people that die and also experience torture and other forms of violence after they are deported. And can we go to the next slide, please? So this graphic just gives a glimpse into how lucrative border imperialism is. As I said, over 70% of people are held in facilities that are operated by private companies. GEO and CoreCivic are really the companies that are gaining the most money from contracts with ICE. They're gaining billions of dollars a year. When ICE is contracting with private companies, there is a bed quota, but these companies are getting paid irrespective of whether that quota is met. So that really motivates ICE to really arrest people so that they're not wasting their money. And again, this is taxpayer money that is going to fuel the prison industrial complex. And as you can see from the slide, the contracts are not just from private prisons. There are all kinds of companies here, like Microsoft, Dell, Western Union, companies that people are more familiar with. So this is something that is very lucrative and really shows the ties between immigration detention and capitalism. We can go to the next slide.
Thank you. And I'll briefly discuss the health rights and protections afforded to people in immigration jails. Next slide, please. And I'll begin with acknowledging that jailing for the mere fact of seeking to resettle is an awful thing to do. But there are some standards that dictate the rights and protections in place when a person does find themselves in immigration jails. ICE operates, as mentioned by, as Gloria mentioned, over 200 detention jails, either directly or through contracts. And over the past 20 years, ICE, ERO, and its predecessors in the INS had promulgated 6 iterations of rules and standards that govern conditions of confinement, program operations, management expectations. And this includes, of course, standards for medical care. A few notable requirements within the, PBNDS is kind of the shortened of those standards are an initial medical, dental, and mental health screening that must happen within 12 hours of arrival in jail, a comprehensive mental health and medical screening within 14 days of arriving in jail, and medical interpretation, as well as access to specialty care and 24-hour emergency medical and mental health treatment. Of course, we have plenty of examples of how this just does not happen, either in a timely manner or within the standards of care that are generally afforded people who are not in jail. Additionally, the United States Courts of Appeal in the Second Circuit, which has jurisdiction over New York, Connecticut, and Vermont, has recognized the constitutional right to mental health discharge planning. Charles versus Orange County was a landmark case of first impression decided in 2019. It was litigated by a team at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest and co-counsel Simpson Thatcher on behalf of two plaintiffs who were diagnosed with mental health conditions. They were detained by ICE at Orange County Jail in New Jersey, then dumped on the streets of New York without medication or any information about how to reconnect with necessary care. This, of course, resulted in immediate and long-lasting harm to our clients, one of whom was eventually institutionalized. And lastly, matter of MAM is a 2011 immigration case that entitles people who are in removal proceedings to competency hearings, where a judge may decide to implement safeguards to ensure that the person receives a fair hearing. This is available to people with mental health diagnoses and developmental disabilities. Unfortunately, detained individuals may face barriers to access these safeguards, including a shortage of mental health providers willing to support these cases, difficulty in obtaining specialized cognitive evaluations, and denials of transportation requests to be evaluated while detained. In my experience, in the majority of these individuals who would benefit from this screening, including many who have suffered traumatic brain injuries and extreme forms of trauma, are not able to secure the safeguards due to, sort of all of these barriers. Next slide, please. So of course, these are some of the, just a few of the many things that we have noted as problems in the detention system. As you saw in a prior slide, immigrant detention system relies heavily on private contractors, including contracting out medical care. Setting aside the inherent cruelty of jailing immigrants, the reliance on private contractors has proven to be detrimental to the people who are subject to enforcement, because there is very little oversight over the care that is received. New York Lawyers for the Public Interest and other advocates, including the House Committee on Homeland Security, have documented many problems and abuses that people face in immigration jails. Next slide, please. And I'll hand it over to, oh, there were some errors there. I'll hand it over to Dr. Sugarman now, who has some case examples and some perspectives as a provider.
So my perspective is as an activist physician and from an my perspective is as a activist physician, not from academia, but I document scars of torture, which are very valuable as evidence when people are applying for asylum. So evidence of torture from their country of origin, meaning that they would be in danger of torture or death were they to be deported. And that's challenging enough to do in the community, but if somebody is detained, if somebody is in an ICE jail, it means that I have to go to the ICE jail to document their scars. But going to ICE jails has given me a window on the horrors of being in a cage in an ICE jail, simply because somebody is seeking safety in this country. So the ICE jail's purpose is just locking people up. It's not because they're considered to be a danger to society. It's a quote civil offense or whatever it is, but that's the result. My most recent example is Georgetown Law School last week asked me to go to an ICE jail. I live in the DC area. They asked me to go to an ICE jail in rural Virginia to document somebody's scars. Round trip driving and getting the permission from the guards to enter, because many times I've gone to an ICE jail after all that very, very long drive and they'll say, I'm sorry. They don't say, I'm sorry. No, you're not allowed to enter. So the driving and the gathering of all the multiple layers of permission took 9 hours. 9 hours. So it was a vacation day for me. That's okay, but 9 hours just so I could look at somebody's scars through glass and using a telephone. It was considered a non-contact. I was only allowed a non-contact visit. So this is the barriers that people face. But what I really want to focus on is one individual, and this is a true story. I've changed all the identifying details, but this is an individual who really encapsulates and illustrates the horrors of ICE jails. So this was a woman who entered the US without a visa. She was seeking asylum, fleeing torture due to her political affiliation from her country of origin, a country that is so well known to torture that the country has, people from that country have TPS status. But she was put into an ICE jail in a very remote rural location. This was during COVID, I communicated with her through Zoom and telephone through her lawyers. So her only crime was seeking asylum, seeking safety in this country. She had high blood pressure that was so neglected that she developed a stroke, even though she was young. And she told the quote health staff at the prison that she was feeling suicidal. The medical notes in the ICE medical notes said this person is suicidal. She needs to be in a psychiatric hospital. Instead, they put her in, like a segregated unit. And, ICE medical notes are in code. Segregated unit means solitary confinement. Her only crime was that she was feeling suicidal. So she, of course, when I interviewed her, was out of solitary. And I said, well, what does that mean, being in solitary confinement? And she described virtually no clothing, a blanket the size of a postage stamp, being freezing, being alone. And you can only imagine how much worse she was after the solitary punishment. And by chance, by the time she finally got released, she was in the geographic area of my clinic and she came to see me. She has not recovered psychologically, psychiatrically. She has not recovered from what our taxpayer dollars have done. And I'll never forget when she saw me in clinic, she got down on her knees to thank me. And I was horrified. I said, please get up. These are my tax dollars that, I'm so ashamed of my country. Please, get up. And, but she has not recovered. And I'll just never forget that. It was, why are we doing this? I'm being sarcastic. Are we any safer as a nation because we're locking up people who are coming to our country seeking safety? It's horrific. The slide that you can see here, it just goes from bad to horrible, and I should give trigger warnings because everything I'm saying is so horrible and so traumatizing to all. This was a well-documented case from Irwin County Jail in Georgia, and as Karina mentioned, there's a whole patchwork of ICE jails, and they're all evil. Some are the for-profit companies, and some are the governmental jails. I think particularly county jails that get ICE contracts, so the counties get a big chunk of change for every immigrant that they lock up. So in the Irwin County Jail, a very courageous nurse, Dawn Wooten, discovered that women who were seeking care from the gynecologist, they were having pelvic pain, various gynecological complaints, went to a gynecologist, I believe, contracted by ICE, and they came out of his office sterilized. So several of the locked up women, the immigrant women blew the whistle, Dawn Wooten blew the whistle. Some of these women were then deported for, as retribution for whistleblowing on their forced sterilization. So imagine again, you're seeking safety in this country and then you end up unable to bear children. And but the prison, I believe, I know the women's division of the prison has shut down, but I think the entire Irwin County Jail has shut down because of the expose of these abuses. Next slide. And the case closer to home, a lawsuit was filed against the Farmville Jail. Farmville is an ICE jail for profit, and it's a jail in rural Virginia. So it's the DC area, one of the DC area jails, and became known as having the highest rate of COVID in the country. And anybody who has worked in ICE jails or been to ICE jails knows that, when COVID came about, an ICE jail could not be a better petri dish, a better environment for the spread of COVID. You've got hundreds or thousands of people crammed in together, no ventilation, no masks, and it's just a perfect recipe for a wildfire spread of COVID. Well, to make matters worse, during the Black Lives Matter protest, Trump decided to bring in ICE officials to DC to, violently retaliate against the Black Lives Matter protesters. But he could only justify putting ICE officials on a plane if he also put detained immigrants on the plane with him. So that is how the Farmville jail got a large infusion of new immigrants, just causing COVID to spread rampantly. A lawsuit developed because a lot of the inmates developed COVID. They were quite sick. They complained to the guards that they were not getting medical treatment, and the guards responded by pepper spraying and tear gassing them. So imagine having a respiratory, a life-threatening respiratory illness. Your throat is raw, you're coughing, you're sneezing, and you get the toxic tear gas and pepper spray. And a lot of these people now have lifelong respiratory and medical problems, long COVID, because of the medical neglect, medical malpractice, and the abuse of pepper spray. So the only way I want to end all these doom and gloom stories is that activism does make a difference. NYLPI, New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, and its medical providers network that we're a part of, does enormous work in advocating to get individuals released from ICE jail, and also working systemically to end the ICE jail horrors. I know we've been working on Orange County, a New York ICE jail where terrible things happen. And we have something in our audience. The sparks of New York Lawyers for the Public Interest now are in Washington, D.C., and Katya will be working on a similar project with the CARE Coalition, Capital Area Immigration Rights Coalition, in the DC metro area to replicate the New York model in the DC area. Very excited to participate. We talked about the ending of ICE jails in New Jersey. There was a strong coalition in Maryland. So Maryland has now ended ICE jails, but we really have to continue the nationwide protest. Pennsylvania has built more jails, more ICE jails to, take up the Maryland and New Jersey people. So, we can't stop until we finish. And lots of good groups working on this. Detention Watch Network is looking at the problem nationwide. Doctors for Camp Closure, and a lot of other groups.
All right. So I'm going to talk for a little while about a research study sort of along the same track. And there's been numerous reports of human rights abuses in detention. And I think Gloria and Karina and Kate set the stage really well. So we don't really need to spend a lot of time in terms of the background of this study, but I will add that what's out there is largely based on perspectives of people other than those who have been detained. And so there's information in the media, there's reports. A lot of that is a little bit more like institutional or anecdotal. And so what motivated this study is that there hasn't really been a lot in terms of the health impact of immigration detention from the perspective of those who've been in detention. So Karina works at the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. They coordinate a medical providers network. You're going to hear some more about that in a while. But a lot of the medical providers have spent time in immigration detention settings, getting forensic evidence that can support immigration cases. And so this study is sort of building off of that network in terms of trying to systematically collect some data around health impacts. So the overall aim of, here, let me move this box. The overall aim of the study was to characterize the health impact of immigration detention from the perspective of people who had been formerly detained. And we chose to conduct a qualitative individual interview study. The reason being, sort of multiple reasons. It's not easy to collect these data, but they're also so rich and important that using a qualitative approach could really capture, I think, some of the important nuance and richness of the experiences that people have had. And so we work with a number of different organizations that are partnered together with NYLPI as well. So this includes the Bronx Defenders, with whom Gloria works, Legal Aid Society, they're more legal advocacy organizations, New Sanctuary Coalition, the First Friends of New York and New Jersey, that are more advocacy organizations. And we asked our partners to provide referrals from their clientele of immigrants who had been in detention and were released. Ideally, we would have liked to conduct the study even in detention settings, but that is close to impossible, I think, from a research and research ethics perspective. And so we asked our partners to refer clients who met these inclusion criteria. They were at least 18 years old. They had been in detention within the past 2 years. They had spent at least 30 days in detention, and they were fluent in either English or Spanish, which were the languages that we were able to collect data with. Importantly, also, we asked for referrals of just a first name or pseudonym and a contact number. We wanted to try to keep this as safe as possible for the participants. So no identifying information were collected at all. And the data that we collected were mostly in the year 2020. So also, contextually, really during the height of the COVID pandemic. So interviews were conducted by phone. We got the first name or pseudonym and a phone number of clients. We called them if they were willing to participate and met inclusion criteria. On the spot, we conducted a telephone interview, which was, as I said, anonymous, typically lasted around 60 minutes. And we had 2 interviewers on the team who did the work. Once we had all the data, then the transcripts were sort of transcribed and translated if necessary. We coded them and then conducted what you'd say is an inductive and deductive thematic analysis, sort of looking for specific things around health impacts, but also seeing what floated to the surface. So over about a year of work, we were able to get referrals for 25 potential participants. I think this speaks to, even in a setting where we're working with organizations that presumably have some trust, that there's probably a large hesitancy to participate in any sort of activity like this. So just getting referrals, we had 25 referrals, and then we were ultimately able to interview 16 of those individuals. So here is a snapshot of the participants in the study. The median age was 35. The large majority identified as male. 5 identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer. In terms of country of birth, it's pretty varied. So the most were from the Dominican Republic, but we had also others from different parts of the Caribbean and Latin America, and also Pakistan, Russia, and Kazakhstan. 4 identified as Black. The median amount of time that people had spent living in the US before detention was 20 years. So these were not people who had just immigrated into the country. Mostly these were people who had been living here for a long time and then were captured by ICE. And they spent a median time of almost 11 months in detention, with some having spent several years in detention. So 14 were detained for at least 6 months. 9 told us that they had experienced solitary confinement while they were in detention, and 12 were in detention during 2020 when COVID was happening. Still happening, but when COVID began happening. So I'm going to talk about really sort of 3 themes that fed into the health impacts, and then talk a little bit about the health impacts that were reported to us. And so the first theme that emerged from our data were the poor conditions and inhumane treatment. And again, I think this is not sort of necessarily new information, but it's powerful to hear it directly from the people who experienced it. People told us about food scarcity, not having enough food, being hungry, the food that they were served being inedible, also feeling like the food that they got was not healthy and contributed to, worsening of medical conditions. We heard about crowding in the dorms. The dorms didn't have ventilation often, and especially during 2020, that this was something that was contributing to COVID. We heard that there wasn't a lot of access to outdoor space at all. And that people felt mistreated by the officers. So in their own words, here are a few quotes from the study. Most of the COs, the correction officers, they treat us like we're garbage. They treat us very bad, and they treat the criminals better than us. We get treated like you have no rights, worse than an animal, and it's terrible. And they tell you right on your face, yeah, you ain't got no rights. I told the doctor, but they didn't check it. They just gave me the ice pack. But the officer said, it's okay, you're not gonna die. And I was really surprised, like he's really thinking about me like that, like I'm not worthy, like I'm really not a human being. You're locked up in a box. You don't even get sunlight. You're begging for sunlight, imagine that. So another thing that emerged really frequently from the interviews was this sense of injustice. Most of the participants in the study did not have any criminal histories, but they still felt like they were treated like criminals in really all aspects of detention. And even those who did have a criminal history where they spent time in criminal jail prior to civil detention felt like their time in detention was worse in many aspects. People also felt like they were stuck in the state of limbo and had no control over how long they were going to be in detention, or no knowledge about how long they were going to spend there. Ultimately, people felt like they had this impossible choice where they could choose indefinite detention or self-deportation, essentially. And they felt like the infrastructure really wielded this pressure on them to sort of force them into this choice. So some participants said, not even 3.5 years that I did in prison had me overwhelmed and stressed out the way being detained for 13 months did. Because when I was incarcerated, in my head, I convinced myself that I'm in this predicament because I put myself in this predicament. I told them, you say I'm not a prisoner here. And they said, you are not, because you can go back to your country. And I told them the problem I have in my country is worse than being here because they will kill me there. I think they want people to become desperate, so they sign their deportation and leave. Officials from ICE would come and ask, how are you doing? And they'd say, the food is awful, I haven't seen a doctor. And they'd say, okay, step in line and sign this deportation form and it will all be over. Finally, we heard about structural barriers to access in medical care, including delays and difficulties actually seeing a provider, not having mental health providers to turn to, interruptions in treatment in terms of medications such as HIV medications, not being able to access language interpretation, and not really having any sort of sense of what might happen to them when they leave detention. And Karina earlier mentioned that some of the constitutional rights that have been established for immigrants in detention include a rapid assessment at the beginning and discharge planning. And we heard many times that neither of those things were really happening. One person wrote, I'd write on the screen, I need to talk to the psychologist. Please, it's urgent. I feel depressed. Please help me. When you write sometime like that, it's because you really have a serious problem. 2 to 3 weeks later, they'd say, okay, come over here. In fact, the doctor told me pretty much, you're not dead yet, so there's no reason for us to help you yet. And so I told him, what are you telling me? You're waiting for me to die or let me to die in order for you to help me? He had the COVID full blown. You could say that it was so bad he couldn't walk. Instead of them sending him to a facility where they could provide better care for him, they kept him in a box, which is solitary confinement, and just fed him aspirins. So I think it's pretty clear that sort of these themes kind of really converge into extreme negative psychological and physical health impacts. So on the psychological end, this sort of sense of persistent fear, insecurity, loss and despair, developing or worsening of already existing anxiety and depression. And on the physical side, physical injuries, new medical problems, challenges managing already existing conditions, and then COVID-19, sort of running rampant in the detention centers. And so just to sort of touch on those a little bit more in terms of the health impacts, we heard about the barriers to care sort of leading to worsening of conditions, the psychological sort of impact of day-to-day life leading to despair and anxiety. And many of these things really persisted even after detention, and people sort of really described the sense of post-traumatic stress disorder. I spent 15 days alone, without even being able to read a book, without being able to read anything. I mean, I was there alone. I got desperate. And again, I wanted to take my own life. I never had suicidal thoughts. I never had depression. I never had anxiety. I didn't know what that word meant until I was in there, you know. These kind of traumas don't go away overnight. I'm walking down the street and I'm afraid that immigration could come at any moment to get me. But you keep thinking that immigration may come anytime. You don't feel free. So just to reflect a little bit on the study, in some sense, it's limited. It was a small number of people. And all the people we talked to were already connected to legal representation, or at the very least, sort of social service assistance in the New York, New Jersey area. So this might not necessarily reflect what's going on elsewhere in the country. And indeed, you know, what's going on elsewhere could be a lot worse. We only spoke to people in English and Spanish, which are by far the most common languages spoken among immigrant detainees in the New York area, but did not necessarily capture the full picture. On the other hand, you know, there haven't really been studies like this in a long time, or so much in US. So we sort of feel like we captured this sort of really important point in immigration history now. And overall, it's so hard to get data from the immigration detention setting that we think this is still an important contribution to the literature. So I think the other things to think about are that this reflects a need for medical providers and mental health providers, especially, who might be, you know, in this conference, for anyone that you might see as a provider who has experienced immigration detention, really a harm reduction, sort of trauma-informed approach in caring for them is going to be really important in terms of dealing with some of the psychological sequelae. I think this also can point to the role of medical advocacy, and so many of all the people we interviewed really were through organizations where people are working to try to document this stuff in order to both, you know, do individual case advocacy and address the system. And finally, it, I think, speaks to the importance of ending detention and prioritizing community-based alternatives for immigration. So just to end this part of the presentation, I want to acknowledge the participants who participated in the study and shared their experiences, our partners in the community and the legal partners, and the study, which is funded by the Einstein Center for Global Health and the Montefiore Department of Medicine. So now I'm going to turn it back to Karina.
Thank you. So now that you've heard sort of the background and some experiences from our providers and research, I wanted to present a possible solution, one solution that we have been devoting a lot of time and effort to developing and hope to see in other spaces as well, and that is our medical provider network. So this is just one way that these networks can operate, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of information about how ours runs. Next slide, please. So to start, I'll just just a few numbers here. We currently have, gosh, when I started 5 years ago, we had 40 doctors, and now we have grown to 255 providers. 110 of them are licensed physicians. We have 118 medical students who are a core demographic in our work. Licensed mental health providers, there's 20. We also work with nurse practitioners, social workers, and other advocates, and we have some of those in our network. I have some data from 2021. We received 90 referrals to our network, and for a group that is run by 2 people, it's a big number, and 49 of those referrals were for general immigration assistance. 23 were COVID immigration referrals. So when the COVID pandemic began in New York, our doctors really just stepped up and started providing these amazing medical advocacy letters that led to a lot of people being released from both criminal and immigration detention, as a result of, the potential harms if they contracted COVID. So by 2021, we were receiving far fewer of those, but there were 23 and 25 for criminal justice referrals. Again, this was an expansion of our work due to the COVID pandemic that has somewhat continued in the subsequent years. 10 individuals of those 90 were released, which is a pretty large number for us. Immigration cases can take a very, very long time. So, some of these outcomes, we don't start seeing results for, 6 months to a year after some of this is litigated in court or some of these letters are provided. So to see 10 in 1 year was a really great number for us. And then about 40% of the 2022 cases that we've gotten so far are requests for either forensic psychological evaluations and primarily to support asylum and CAT conventions against torture cases. A growing proportion of our cases also are for cognitive and psychological evaluations of people with a history of traumatic brain injury for MAM hearings. And unfortunately, because of some of the barriers that I mentioned earlier, those are cases that are hard to place, and we'd love to have more providers join our network to be able to help folks. Next slide, please. And this is just like a little overview about sort of how the cases flow through our system. A legal provider, including folks from the Bronx Defenders, and in New York, we have the NYLPI, the New York Family Unity Project, which funds legal defense for immigration proceedings. And so a lot of those folks partner with us to contact us on behalf of their clients. NYLPI then, a NYLPI organizer or advocate tries to place the case with one of our volunteers. Sometimes they work in a team with medical students. And once they're matched, the volunteer providers work to review medical records, schedule in-person evaluations as needed to complete the request. Then NYLPI staff serves as a liaison between the medical and legal teams to help coordinate any assistance that is needed, including sometimes providing interpretation if some of the teams don't have the capacity. Once the document is produced, it is sent to the legal team. And then NYLPI continues to follow the case to document outcomes in hopes of release or detention or other positive outcomes for the case. In addition to the casework, we also provide trainings and support opportunities for clinicians to engage in legislative processes and public advocacy. Next slide, please. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Sugarman and Dr. Ross and Gloria also, who is our social worker in the space, to maybe describe a bit more about sort of the kinds of work they've done as advocates and, any other perspectives they might have as providers, as advocates.
Okay, I can go ahead and go. As Karina said, I am a social worker. A lot of the work that I do with clients who are detained is processing their trauma, processing their emotions, engaging in political education and psychoeducation, and also practicing advocacy. And a lot of times the advocacy is connecting the clients that I work with to medical services, including contracting with mental health clinicians to conduct psychological and psychiatric evaluations. There was a study done in 2008 that cited that when asylum cases have psychological evaluations, they are 89% successful, and the contrast to the national average of without one was around like 37%. And I think that really goes to show how powerful it is when mental health clinicians are able to collaborate with us in order to advocate for our clients. In our work, the goal is always to free people. Though some clients are not actually detained in carceral facilities, they still experience detention through ICE's Alternatives to Detention program. I want to be very clear that the only alternative to detention is for people to be free. What ICE names as alternatives to detention are really just alternative forms of, of detention. And some of these forms of surveillance and carcerality include bond check-ins at ICE offices, home visits and check-ins, telephonic monitoring, downloading a application to your smartphone that has facial recognition and that is also tracking you. And then of course, like GPS monitoring through electronic ankle monitors. And a lot of times people think that these other forms of surveillance and carcerality are less harmful than being in a carceral facility. And that is just not true. Like all of it is really, really awful. Some of the harms that can come from these other forms of detention include people having to miss work because they get really large timeframes for an ICE check-in. So the check-in may say like, we're gonna show up between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. And so somebody just has to be home because they don't know when the ICE officer is gonna show up. There was a client that I had where he had an ankle monitor, and having an ankle monitor really exacerbated his mental health symptoms. It increased his suicidal ideation. He was more anxious and more depressed. He had to charge his ankle monitor throughout his workday, and he was not getting paid during the times that he was charging his ankle monitor. He also experienced stigmatization from people at work because he had an ankle monitor. There are programs that also make you give the name and phone number of somebody close to you. So for example, if you don't answer when they're trying to check in with you, they call somebody else. And this also creates conflicts in people's lives, especially when for a lot of undocumented people, the other people who are close to them are also undocumented. And then there's also just the fear of putting other people at risk because of the tracking. So for example, in 2019, ICE used the electronic tracking to arrest around 700 people at a poultry plant in Mississippi. And this was one of the largest raids that has happened. And I also just want to name the disproportionality that also happens in this form of incarceration. There was a study done last year by the Cardozo School of Law in New York that showed that Black immigrants are twice as likely to be subjected to e-shackling as other immigrants. And this is not the only form of disproportionality that happens. Even though Black immigrants are 7% of all undocumented people, they make up 20% of those who are in the deportation proceedings, and they have higher bonds, higher detention times, and also higher rates of being in solitary confinement. I think that this is something that is really important to note because the anti-Black violence that happens throughout the prison system, throughout the medical industrial complex is also affecting Black people who are in immigration proceedings. And so these are all things that we try to work on as social workers and attorneys who are in the legal space. And again, it's really helpful when we are able to partner with mental health clinicians to provide more context about the traumas that people have experienced and also how they are continuously being re-traumatized by being incarcerated, whether that is through being in a facility or other forms of incarceration.
Those are really, I think, super important points, Gloria. I think, in terms of on the advocacy side, so as Karina kind of pointed out, there's a pretty big network of medical providers, so both licensed providers and trainees, and so I think it sort of creates a platform for advocacy on a number of levels. So one is, of course, I think the individual cases and being able to being able to advocate for someone to be out of detention is a huge victory, even if it's one person. And so just sort of NYLPI as a sort of coordinator for that, and having a bunch of clinicians who are able to step up and do that, I think is a super powerful thing. Having a platform like that also feeds, I guess, I don't want to say down, but feeds to the providers in the sense of having some level of support. So there are more experienced providers who are working with trainees, right? Where you're sort of like building the capacity of the network, and also a resource to answer questions when people aren't entirely sure what to do. There's also the connection between sort of clinician and lawyer that I think can be helpful not only for the individual case, but if you're seeing immigrants in clinic and you have legal questions, you have a resource, and vice versa. And then there's the sort of advocacy as a unit as well. So NYLPI has coordinated sort of sign-ons to a number of different open letters to government officials at the federal level, at the state level, to advocate for efforts to close immigration jails. And people in the medical provider network have also come together to write op-eds in media and do media interviews, I think, to advocate for that as well. So yeah, I think as you probably heard a couple times already, like one piece that could use a little bit of support is the mental health piece. And there's such a huge mental health impact in immigration detention from the conditions of detention. And often people who are in detention already experienced multiple traumas en route to getting to detention. And having experts in the field who can, testify to that and advocate for both individual and systematic changes there could be really helpful. And we're obviously happy to speak more about it if anyone is interested in talking.
And just a few other points. Writing a letter to get somebody out of an ICE jail is actually an extremely time-consuming letter, and medical students have been invaluable. And it's a win-win, because sometimes, medical students, they're not with patients, they're eager to do something clinical, and so the medical students can do a lot of the original, the initial chart review and write a draft of the letter. And I mean, at the peak of COVID, we were just writing so many letters, and we could not have done it without medical students. So it just made an enormous difference. A few other thoughts. There's a human rights lawyer that I've worked with. She's at the border. The beauty of this work is I can do it all from home, except for an occasional trip to an ICE jail. But there is a brilliant a human rights lawyer at the Texas-Mexico border. Her name is Charlene DeCruz. And she has said so aptly, we are fighting against very formidable, very powerful systems of oppression, and the medical legal partnership really is chipping away at the system, so as opposed to one doctor, one lawyer, one nurse practitioner, the partnership has been very powerful, and we are able to make a difference. And just a few other thoughts. During Trump, everybody was out on the streets and protesting against family separation. Well, ICE jails are family separation, and we should keep that front and center. Another thought is that, when somebody is in, an American jail for whatever crime they're accused of, generally there's a release date. But when you're in an ICE jail, there is no release date. You don't get out until a lawyer or somebody figures out how to get you out. And some people are so despondent that they will choose to self-deport. And you wonder if that's not the goal anyway. So it's just a few thoughts, but medical provider networks, NYLPI, we'd love more volunteers and spread the word. And, it's very, very impactful work.
Yeah, so I can open it up to, I can't quite get off on video. Oh, here we go. I'll open it up to questions. I don't know if I can't see the audience. So if there are any questions for any of the presenters, I don't know if we can pull up the presentation. At the end of the presentation, there's, I included my contact information in case anybody does want to reach out after the conference as well.
Great. Any questions for our presenters? Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much. This is great. So I'm actually a law student, and I was a paralegal with the NYLPI program at Legal Aid before I came to law school, and one of the like issues that you all flagged many times, but that we saw a lot, was how hard it was to get medical providers and mental health providers to go to the jails to do evaluations. And as there's more advocacy to shut down jails, which is wonderful, it does mean that people are being detained in more places that are more and more remote from cities. And so I guess I was wondering, as like physicians and social workers and advocates, like very embedded in creating these partnerships, if you have thoughts about how to like get more folks from the provider side invested in doing the work of like traveling and meeting people where they're at, because ICE is not going to bend on bringing them to where care is.
Gloria and Karina, did you hear the question? Yeah, okay. Well, I think my one thought is, just sort of building the network, and obviously the farther it is from where you are, like the harder it's going to be to convince someone, but there's a lot of interest, I think, in advocacy among many different clinicians about many different things, and it's certainly including immigration advocacy. And so the more people know that there is a way that they can be involved and be helpful, I think fine, you'll lose some people who are not going to necessarily want to travel as far, but you'll gain more people who want to make some kind of contribution.
But one thing you'll learn about the carceral system in general is very capricious and unpredictable. So I have some case, I haven't even reviewed it yet, but whatever it is I'm doing it remotely on Monday. So, but you can't predict. I think the person's on the West Coast. I haven't even, so sometimes, during COVID, we were allowed much more flexibility in remote visits. I know for the rural jail in Virginia last week, I said, can I do it remotely? And they said, oh no, you have to come in person. But yet they made it a non-contact visit through glass, and I had to use, this telephone on a cord because of COVID. Well, if you're that worried about COVID, why can't I do it by Zoom or some kind of virtual method? So it's completely unpredictable, but this coming Monday, I am doing a virtual interview. So, and you can ask the lawyers to press for that. And even mental health, even though I'm a primary care doctor, I'm not a mental health doctor. Primary care is, we diagnose depression, PTSD, anxiety all the time. That's within our scope of practice. And there was a case through NYLPI that I worked on once, and it was basically talking about somebody's competence, somebody having memory issues, and why, applying for asylum is extremely adversarial. So, imagine if somebody asked you, well, what happened on Tuesday, March 3rd in 2013? Did they, what did the police do on that day? You can't remember. And then imagine having traumatic brain injury and PTSD and depression and all kinds of things that impair your ability to recall events chronologically. So I once did do a remote evaluation for, talking about why somebody had legitimate problems with their memory and with their recall. And I was able to do that remotely. Now that was early on in COVID, but yeah, I would keep pressing to have the remote option, but it's up to the whims of the jail.
Hi, so I'm a psychiatric nurse. I'm maybe a little more than halfway through my psychiatric APRN program here. Actually working, I'm really interested in this topic because I've worked as an RN with I hope RebPsych is an okay word to use that. Okay, so and just felt like so ill-equipped to help them whatsoever. So I guess part of my question is probably maybe for Gloria. It's part of what the evidence-based paper I'm working on is like what the trauma is so multi-layered on so many different areas and so pervasive for so many of these people. So like what have you found to be some of the best therapeutic techniques? And then my other question is, I think you're all from New York, so like what can I do here in Connecticut?
That is a really good question. One thing I want to say, and this also touches on the previous question that was asked, something that has recently happened is that, so a lot of the clients that we have are at Orange County Jail, which is in New York. And recently, OCJ has told us that for any people that come and do evaluations in person, that they have to be licensed. This was not something that was previously a requirement. And they're also saying that for even some people who are doing them virtually, that they have to be licensed. So this is just, I want to say that as a way to name how the facilities are also just adding more barriers, even though like they don't know anything about our professions. And like historically, it has been fine to use people who are unlicensed and are being supervised by a licensed person. They are now making it harder to do that. So that's just one thing I want to say. And in terms of therapeutic techniques, I feel like this is a question where there's not really like a right answer, because I feel like a lot of times we're so limited in the ways that we are able to engage with our clients, because maybe like the video system isn't working, or people are in a unit where there is no video system. At Orange, they're really taking down a lot of the video systems that they have. So maybe we are speaking with them telephonically, but sometimes people are brought late to their telephone visits, or they're not even told about the fact that they have a phone call or a video call. And then we are also limited in terms of what we are able to send to clients. But some things that we do, we have, for example, a database of different therapeutic worksheets that we have. So depending on where the client is, we may be able to send those worksheets to them, and we can work through them via the video system or over the phone. But again, like if they're in a facility where the mail takes really long, that may not work. Some other things that we do a lot of breathing exercises with our clients to think of ways that people can access resources within themselves that do not require like necessarily movement or having something tangible in front of them. We sometimes do things like meditation. Sometimes we use like our own devices to play music so that people can hear music, because some people are in facilities where they don't have radios or ways to access music and sound. We also send books to our clients, so that's something that has been really useful. We incorporate spirituality in our work if clients are spiritual, and that is a way for them to help process the trauma they are experiencing. But for a lot of people, the goal is that if they're free, that we would then be able to connect them to more adequate therapeutic services, because just what is being offered inside the facilities is really abysmal, and it's really not what should be considered care.
Just in terms of being in Connecticut, I mean, Kate's from Maryland, and yeah, it's not like state specific because it's federal. It's a federal thing. So
Okay.
Karina could probably speak to the best, but you should join.
Okay.
You got Karina's information, right?
I do know.
Okay, and then, like I said, as a student, you know, we could always put your work with chart reviews and things like that. It's invaluable because, you know, I worked full-time, I do a lot of activism, and if I had to review all those charts, I would just, no. So I outsource more to medical students, or, you know, NP, you're an NP program?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we supervise and we co-sign everything. So, you know, you're just doing the first leg of the work, but the students make it possible to do all these cases.
Okay.
And I think it's win-win. The students actually like it because it's more like hands-on, and we love the assistants.
Okay, great.
Oh, please. Our newest.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm coming at this kind of from the legal side. I'm a recent law school graduate, so also just cannot emphasize how invaluable it is to have the help of medical professionals and the effort to get people out of detention and to some modicum of safety. The question that I had for all the speakers was, I'd be so curious to hear about your experiences of kind of scaling this work and figuring out a way of collecting data or, like stringing together all of these individual case experiences that you're seeing in the field into the kind of advocacy that can really convey like the scope of the issue and the scope of the damage that is being inflicted through these forms of detention and that surveillance.
Yeah, I can start with that one. So when I was brought on to NYLPI, a lot of what I was doing is really sort of building out the capacity to take these cases from referral to outcome to data collection, which sounds super boring, but I love doing this because it is really where we get a lot of our ammunition to call for systemic change publicly. Some of the things that we have done, and I'm sorry that I didn't post them here, but you can look up New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, Detained and Denied, and then Still Detained and Denied. We published two reports detailing some of the abuses and neglect that we saw in our in just through managing these cases, essentially just through being the middle person in these cases between the providers and the legal providers and the medical providers. And some of that is detailed in the presentation that I gave. In the first one was in 2017, was published in 2017. In 2018, we had a House committee actually write a letter to ICE asking questions about the medical care and citing the report. So that was really a huge one for us as well. Of course, the answers were completely insufficient. And then, of course, we continue to lobby and write publicly and publicize these horrors wherever we can, so that both legal, medical, the general public is aware of what is going on. Yeah, I mean, so those are some of the things that we've done, and I think obviously working with the doctors and providing support and all of the providers to provide support to help them leverage their social standing, right? Doctors are a very respected sort of category of people in our society for very good reasons. And we have these amazing doctors who are really willing to put their name, their experience out there to advocate for people. And also, we also have litigation that through representation of individuals like Mr. Charles and Mrs. Smalls in the Charles versus Orange County, can lead to systemic changes. We did establish this, right to mental health discharge planning in the Second Circuit. So the goal is always to go after ICE, but as you can see from all of the sort of network of contractors, it's hard to get at them, but it's something we keep trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, it's not easy. There's 250,000 people detained every day. We managed to collect data from 14 people who had been previously detained. That's, a drop in the bucket. And it's like the whole system is kind of extremely not transparent, by intention. But, we've talked about that also to beyond, I think, sort of the compiling of reports and the advocacy and all of the amazing things that Karina just mentioned, that we'd like to try to do more research data, potentially through even collecting data from people who have evaluated, from clinicians who've evaluated detainees, or I don't know if people have other creative ideas. I think about how to sort of get the data that research data is a powerful advocacy tool. Journalists, politicians, research data. So it's certainly something we continue to think about doing.
This is not research driven, but NYLPI also has a comms team, a communication team, and I'm a full-time doctor, full-time activist, and I'm not a writer, but I do like to pitch ideas. And then sometimes the NYLPI comms team can make it, into an op-ed or into, get into, I don't know, publications like The Hill or something like that. Most recently, NYLPI offered, this is not on regarding detained people, but regarding all the people being bussed up from the Texas border. And now the quote liberal New York, Washington mayors are, really dropping the ball, and New York wants to build 10 cities and it's cold out, and DC is offering only 3 days of services. And so NYLPI even offered to help, with an article, so they have a communications team also, which is, it's not data, but it's great on spreading the word and influencing public opinion.
Yeah, this will be the last question, but go
Oh,
ahead.
okay. My name is Onyi. I'm a physician and child psychiatrist here at Yale. Thank you all for a really, really interesting talk. I'm wondering if you all ever deal with unaccompanied minors or families, or is it only with individual adults?
Children, children, I don't know if you're aware, but children are not, unaccompanied children, unaccompanied minors are not through Department of Homeland Security. They go under Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is Health and Human Services. So it's a whole different bucket, but I would love to talk to you afterwards. There's lots of abuses going on in ORR facilities, but issues come up with parents and children, how to reunify them. Aside from Trump family separation, even now, families get separated. So I don't think we're really addressing that so much because the kids are under ORR, but lots and lots of issues, and we should connect.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Gloria, go ahead. There's time for a last comment if you'd like.
Okay, I was just gonna say, yeah, the majority of our work that we do is with adults. We do work with some adults who are on the younger side, and those are usually clients that we're working with for applying for special immigrant juvenile status, which is a classification that is available to some undocumented immigrants who are under 21, but we do not work with youth and people who are younger.
Just one quick one too. Some of the work that we do is on for the benefit of an adult, undocumented person, but does require interviews and evaluations of their US citizen children, because they would be harmed should they be removed. So it is something that we do, and we don't have a lot of providers who specialize in sort of pediatric mental health, provisions. So if you would like to connect, I'd love to speak to you.
Yes.
I love the call to action.
Yeah.
That this was such a great frame for the work that y'all are doing. That's inspiring. Thank you so much for coming. And so we're going to have a coffee break now, which is back at the Harkness Auditorium. Yeah, so we can just move that way. Thank you so much.
I'm a vulture.